October 14, 1988, Kern County, California. The Tehachapi Pass wind farm stood as a testament to America's growing commitment to renewable energy. Rows of white turbines stretched across the Golden Hills, their massive blades cutting through the desert air with rhythmic precision. For the workers who maintained these giants, it was demanding but stable work in a region where employment opportunities remained scarce. Timothy Richardson had worked as a wind turbine operator for Windtech Industries for nearly 6 years. At 32 years old, he was known among his colleagues as meticulous and safety-conscious, the kind of worker who double-checked every bolt and never cut corners. His wife Jessica often joked that he cared more about those turbines than he did about their aging station wagon. But those who worked alongside Timothy understood that his dedication came from respect for the machinery and awareness of the dangers inherent in maintaining structures that towered 200 feet above the ground. So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from. The weather forecast for October 14th had predicted strong winds, nothing unusual for Tehachapi Pass. The region was chosen for wind farming precisely because of its consistent and powerful air currents funneling through the mountain corridor. However, by early afternoon, conditions deteriorated rapidly. What meteorologists initially classified as a standard autumn wind event transformed into something far more severe. Gusts exceeding 70 miles per hour battered the installation, forcing the emergency shutdown of multiple turbines across the facility. Timothy's blue pickup truck was found in the parking area near turbine number 47 at approximately 6:30 that evening. The driver's side door hung open, and his thermos of coffee sat undisturbed in the cup holder, still warm to the touch. His safety helmet was discovered 30 feet from the vehicle, lying in the dirt near the turbine's base access door. The metal door itself swung freely in the violent wind, its lock mechanism damaged. When Timothy failed to return home that night, Jessica immediately contacted the company's emergency line. By dawn on October 15th, a search operation was underway. Colleagues scoured the wind farm while local authorities coordinated aerial searches of the surrounding desert terrain. The assumption among most searchers was straightforward. Timothy had been inspecting turbine 47 when the storm intensified, and something had gone terribly wrong. Perhaps he had been struck by debris, disoriented by the wind, or suffered some other weather-related mishap. However, certain details troubled the lead investigator assigned to the case. Detective Stephen Morrison noted that Timothy's truck keys remained in the ignition, his wallet sat in the glove compartment, and his work radio lay on the passenger seat, still functional. For an experienced operator responding to an emergency situation, abandoning communication equipment made no sense. Furthermore, Turbine 47's maintenance log showed no scheduled inspections for that day. Company protocol strictly prohibited solo turbine access during severe weather conditions. On the third day of searching, investigators discovered Timothy's work notebook wedged between rocks approximately 100 yards from the turbine. The notebook contained detailed technical observations spanning several months, including measurements, diagrams, and timestamps. Most entries documented routine maintenance checks and operational parameters. However, the final pages told a different story. Timothy had recorded what he termed structural irregularities in multiple turbines, with particular focus on turbine 47. His notes referenced unauthorized modifications, non-standard components, and potential catastrophic failure points. More troubling still, these technical concerns appeared nowhere in Windtech Industries' official maintenance reports. When Detective Morrison requested access to the company's internal documentation for turbines flagged in Timothy's notebook, he encountered unexpected resistance. Corporate representatives cited proprietary information concerns and insisted that all equipment met or exceeded safety standards. They characterized Timothy's notebook observations as the work of an overly cautious employee who lacked proper engineering credentials to make such assessments. Jessica Richardson refused to accept the emerging narrative that her husband had acted recklessly. She told investigators that Timothy had been increasingly anxious in the weeks before his disappearance. He mentioned wanting to meet with upper management about safety issues, but feared retaliation. The wind farm operated in a competitive market with thin profit margins, and workers understood that raising concerns about expensive repairs or equipment replacement could cost them their jobs. By the end of October 1988, with no body recovered and no conclusive evidence of what had happened, the official investigation began to lose momentum. Windtech Industries released a statement expressing sympathy for the Richardson family while emphasizing their commitment to worker safety. The company suggested that Timothy had likely wandered away from the turbine in confusion during the storm and succumbed to the harsh desert environment. Search teams had covered a 20-mile radius without finding any trace of him. Yet Detective Morrison couldn't dismiss what he had read in that notebook. Timothy Richardson had documented something significant, something that made him willing to risk his career to bring it to management's attention. The detective made copies of the notebook and filed them with the case evidence, uncertain whether they represented the observations of a dedicated safety advocate or the final paranoid writings of a man about to make a fatal mistake. As winter approached and the case grew cold, one question continued to haunt everyone who had known Timothy Richardson. What had he discovered in Turbine 47 that was important enough to bring him out into a violent storm? And why had he never made it home? What investigators didn't yet realize was that the answers to these questions lay hidden inside the very structure they had searched, waiting in silence for someone to look in exactly the right place. November 1988. The initial fervor surrounding Timothy Richardson's disappearance had subsided into the bureaucratic machinery of an ongoing investigation. Detective Stephen Morrison found himself increasingly isolated in his conviction that something more sinister than a weather-related accident had occurred at the Tehachapi Pass wind farm. His superiors, facing pressure from both the county administration and Windtech Industries' legal team, encouraged him to accept the most straightforward explanation and close the case. Morrison's examination of Windtech Industries revealed a company navigating turbulent financial waters. Founded in 1982 during the renewable energy boom triggered by federal tax incentives, Windtech had expanded rapidly, perhaps too rapidly. Internal documents obtained through persistent legal requests showed mounting operational costs and increasing competition from larger energy corporations. The Tehachapi facility, one of their oldest installations, required constant maintenance as its first-generation turbines aged beyond their projected service life. The detective's attention focused on Robert Mitchell, Timothy's direct supervisor at the wind farm. Mitchell had worked for Windtech since its founding and held considerable authority over maintenance schedules, equipment purchases, and operational procedures. During his initial interview, Mitchell portrayed Timothy as a competent but occasionally overcautious worker who sometimes saw problems where none existed. According to Mitchell, Timothy had never formally raised safety concerns through proper channels, making his notebook observations little more than personal speculation. However, when Morrison cross-referenced Mitchell's statements with interviews from other wind farm employees, inconsistencies emerged. 3 technicians independently mentioned that Timothy had requested a meeting with upper management approximately 1 week before his disappearance. The meeting's purpose, according to these witnesses, involved what Timothy described as critical safety documentation that needed immediate review by qualified engineers. Mitchell had allegedly promised to arrange this meeting, but claimed Timothy later canceled it without explanation. When confronted with this contradiction, Mitchell revised his statement. He acknowledged that Timothy had indeed approached him about scheduling a management meeting, but insisted the request was withdrawn after preliminary discussions. Mitchell suggested that Timothy had perhaps realized his concerns were unfounded, or that he lacked sufficient evidence to support his claims. The supervisor produced no documentation of these preliminary discussions, stating they had been informal conversations that didn't warrant official record-keeping. Financial analysis of Windtech Industries' operational expenditures revealed troubling patterns. Between 1986 and 1988, the company had dramatically reduced spending on certified replacement parts while increasing purchases from lesser-known suppliers, offering significantly cheaper components. Industry experts consulted by Morrison explained that wind turbine safety depended heavily on using manufacturer-approved parts that met strict engineering specifications. Substituting non-certified components, even in seemingly minor systems, could create cascading structural vulnerabilities that might not become apparent until catastrophic failure occurred. The detectives' investigation uncovered another concerning detail. Windtech had hired an independent engineering consultant named Charles Porter in early 1988 to conduct a comprehensive safety assessment of their aging turbine fleet. Porter, a respected mechanical engineer with expertise in wind energy systems, had spent 3 months examining the Tehachapi installation. His preliminary reports, submitted in March 1988, flagged numerous maintenance deficiencies and recommended immediate corrective actions for several turbines, including Turbine 47. Morrison attempted to contact Charles Porter for follow-up interviews regarding his findings. What he discovered added another layer of mystery to the case. Porter had ceased all communication with Windtech Industries in July 1988, approximately 3 months before Timothy's disappearance. Company representatives claimed Porter had accepted a lucrative position in Europe and relocated overseas. However, Morrison could find no forwarding address, no international employment records, and no response to messages left at Porter's last known residence in Sacramento. Porter's preliminary engineering reports had never been finalized. Windtech executives stated that the consultant had abandoned the project without completing his contractual obligations, leaving them unable to act on incomplete assessments. The company had hired a different engineering firm to conduct a subsequent review, which found all turbines operating within acceptable parameters. This second assessment, completed in August 1988, made no mention of the deficiencies Porter had identified months earlier. As Morrison dug deeper, he encountered a pattern of uncooperative witnesses and missing documentation. Several former Windtech employees who might have provided valuable information about maintenance practices had left the company under circumstances that prevented them from speaking freely. Non-disclosure agreements, settlement terms from labor disputes, and concerns about future employment prospects created a wall of silence around the wind farm's internal operations. In early December 1988, an anonymous phone call reached the detective's office. The caller, speaking through obvious voice distortion, claimed to have worked at the Tehachapi facility during the period of Timothy's disappearance. According to this witness, unusual activity had occurred at the wind farm on the night of October 14th, continuing well past the time when the storm should have made all work impossible. The caller described seeing multiple vehicles near Turbine 47 Long after Timothy's truck had been discovered, and hearing sounds of heavy machinery operating despite the severe weather conditions. Before Morrison could ask substantive questions, the caller abruptly ended the conversation with a warning that others who had tried to expose problems at Windtech had suffered serious consequences. The call had originated from a payphone in Bakersfield, 40 miles from the wind farm, leaving no way to trace or verify the witness's identity. Morrison prepared a detailed report for the district attorney's office, outlining his concerns about potential criminal activity at Windtech Industries. The report documented the inconsistencies in Robert Mitchell's statements, the suspicious disappearance of engineer Charles Porter, the dramatic reduction in certified parts expenditures, and Timothy Richardson's notebook observations suggesting dangerous equipment modifications. The detective requested authorization for a more aggressive investigation, including search warrants for company facilities and financial records. The district attorney's office reviewed Morrison's report and declined to pursue further action. Without a body, without definitive evidence of foul play, and facing potential legal challenges from a corporation with substantial resources, prosecutors determined that the case didn't meet the threshold for criminal investigation. Timothy Richardson's disappearance was officially classified as a probable accidental death, with the case remaining open but inactive. Detective Morrison filed his evidence and moved on to other assignments, but he never stopped wondering about Turbine 47 and what secrets it might hold. Somewhere in that massive structure, or in the desert beyond it, lay the truth about what had happened to Timothy Richardson. That truth would remain hidden for 35 years, waiting for someone with the right expertise and the determination to look in places no one had thought to search before. And when that moment finally came, it would reveal not just the fate of one missing man, but a conspiracy that had claimed more lives than anyone had suspected. January 1989. The case of Timothy Richardson had faded from public attention, relegated to the unfortunate category of workplace accidents that occasionally plagued industrial operations. Jessica Richardson found herself alone with unanswered questions and a growing conviction that her husband's disappearance involved circumstances far more troubling than anyone was willing to acknowledge. In the months following Timothy's disappearance, Jessica made a discovery that would prove significant decades later. While organizing her husband's personal belongings, she found a safety deposit box key hidden inside one of his work boots. Timothy had never mentioned maintaining a safety deposit box, and Jessica had no knowledge of which bank might hold it. Methodically, she contacted every financial institution within 50 miles of their home until she located the box at a small credit union in Tehachapi. Inside the deposit box, Jessica discovered what Timothy had been preparing: a comprehensive documentation package that went far beyond the notebook found near Turbine 47. The materials included dozens of photographs showing internal turbine components, each image carefully labeled with dates, turbine numbers, and technical specifications. Accompanying the photographs were measurement records demonstrating that critical structural elements had been replaced with components that didn't match original equipment standards. Most damning were the procurement invoices Timothy had somehow obtained, showing that Windtech Industries had purchased large quantities of turbine parts from unauthorized suppliers at prices dramatically below standard rates for certified components. These suppliers operated without the engineering certifications required for safety-critical wind turbine equipment. Timothy had cross-referenced part numbers, traced supplier locations, and documented a systematic pattern of cost-cutting that compromised structural integrity across multiple turbines in the Tehachapi installation. Jessica brought this evidence to Detective Morrison in February 1989. The detective immediately recognized its significance, understanding that Timothy had been building a formal case against his employer before his disappearance. The documentation was organized methodically, suggesting Timothy had planned to present it to regulatory authorities or perhaps to media outlets if internal channels failed to produce action. Morrison reopened his investigation with renewed determination, armed with evidence that went beyond circumstantial observation. However, his efforts encountered immediate obstacles. Windtech Industries' legal team obtained a court order preventing the release of Timothy's documentation to regulatory agencies, arguing that the materials contained proprietary business information stolen by an employee. The company filed a lawsuit against Jessica Richardson for possession of corporate property, seeking both return of the documents and financial damages. The legal battle stretched across months, draining Jessica's limited resources, while Windtech's corporate attorneys deployed procedural delays and technical objections. The company's position maintained that Timothy had removed confidential materials without authorization, and therefore his documentation represented theft rather than whistleblowing. Furthermore, Windtech argued that even if the photographs and invoices were authentic, they represented selective evidence taken out of context by someone lacking engineering expertise to properly interpret technical specifications. During this period, Morrison continued investigating the disappearance of Charles Porter, the engineering consultant who had conducted the 1988 safety assessment. The detective finally located Porter's sister in Oregon, who provided disturbing information. Charles had contacted her in June 1988, expressing concern about his work for Windtech Industries. He had discovered significant safety violations during his turbine inspections and faced pressure from company management to modify his findings before submitting the final report. Porter told his sister he planned to refuse the requested modifications and would instead submit his original assessment to California's occupational safety authorities. After that conversation, his sister never heard from him again. Her attempts to file a missing person report in California were unsuccessful because Charles was an adult with no dependents, and his landlord reported that he had vacated his apartment, taking all possessions. Without evidence of foul play, authorities classified Porter as a voluntary missing person who had chosen to sever contact with his previous life. Morrison's investigation revealed that Charles Porter's final known location was Kern County, approximately 1 week after his last conversation with his sister. Bank records showed Porter had withdrawn $5,000 in cash and closed his accounts. His vehicle was found abandoned at a bus station in Bakersfield with the keys in the ignition. But no witnesses recalled seeing anyone matching Porter's description boarding any buses. His professional licenses and certifications were never renewed, and he made no subsequent contact with former colleagues or clients. The parallels between Porter's disappearance and Timothy Richardson's case were impossible to ignore. Both men had discovered serious safety issues at the Windtech facility. Both had expressed intention to escalate their concerns beyond company management. Both had vanished under circumstances that suggested they had left voluntarily, yet neither had contacted family members afterward. Morrison prepared a supplemental report linking the two cases and arguing for a comprehensive criminal investigation. In March 1989, the legal dispute over Timothy's documentation reached a settlement. Jessica Richardson agreed to return the original materials to Windtech Industries in exchange for the company dropping its lawsuit and providing her with copies of all documents. The settlement included a confidentiality agreement preventing Jessica from publicly discussing the contents of Timothy's evidence package. Morrison retained his own copies of the materials as part of the official case file, but without prosecutorial support, he had no mechanism to compel further investigation. Windtech Industries announced a voluntary safety review of their Tehachapi facility, conducted by an independent engineering firm selected by the company. The review, completed in May 1989, found minor maintenance issues that were promptly corrected, but concluded that all turbines operated safely within industry standards. The company received no citations or penalties from regulatory agencies. Detective Morrison retired in 1995, carrying with him the frustration of an investigation he believed had been deliberately obstructed. He maintained personal copies of all case materials, organized chronologically in storage boxes that he kept in his garage. Before his death in 2018, Morrison transferred these materials to his daughter, with instructions that they should be preserved in case future developments warranted reopening the investigation. The Tehachapi Pass wind farm continued operating through the 1990s and 2000s, though ownership changed hands multiple times as the wind energy industry consolidated. Windtech Industries was acquired by a larger corporation in 1996, and the original company name gradually disappeared from public records. Workers who had known Timothy Richardson retired or moved to other employment, taking their memories of October 1988 with them. Turbine 47 remained in operation for decades, its massive blades continuing to rotate above the desert floor, keeping whatever secrets it held locked deep within its structure. The truth about what Timothy Richardson had discovered, and what had happened to him for making that discovery, seemed destined to remain forever hidden. But industrial equipment doesn't keep secrets indefinitely. Metal corrodes, structures deteriorate, and eventually, time itself becomes the investigator that human authorities failed to be. In 2023, 35 years after Timothy Richardson vanished into a desert storm, that moment of revelation would finally arrive through the routine work of an engineer who understood that sometimes the most important discoveries are found in the places everyone assumed had already been thoroughly searched. April 2023, Kern County, California. The renewable energy landscape had transformed dramatically since 1988, with modern wind turbines dwarfing their first-generation predecessors. The original Tehachapi Pass wind farm, now operated by Pacific Renewable Energy Corporation, faced a decision point. The aging turbines, including those installed in the 1980s, had exceeded their projected operational lifespan. Corporate management authorized a decommissioning project to replace the oldest equipment with newer, more efficient technology. Daniel Harris, a structural engineer specializing in wind turbine assessment, received the contract to conduct pre-decommissioning inspections. At 47 years old, Harris had spent 2 decades evaluating wind energy installations across North America. His reputation for thoroughness and technical precision made him the preferred choice for complex projects requiring detailed structural analysis. The inspection protocol required comprehensive documentation of each turbine's condition before dismantling could begin. This included external assessments, internal component examinations, and verification that no environmental hazards existed within the structures. Harris approached the work methodically, beginning with the oldest turbines in the installation and working systematically through the inventory. Turbine 47 was scheduled for inspection during the third week of April. Harris noted its designation in the work order, but had no knowledge of its significance in the 1988 disappearance. The turbine appeared unremarkable from the exterior, its white paint weathered by decades of sun and wind, its blades showing typical wear patterns from millions of rotations. Harris ascended the internal ladder system, conducting visual examinations of structural components at various levels. The tower's interior displayed the expected corrosion and deterioration consistent with equipment operating in harsh desert conditions for 35 years. However, when Harris reached the nacelle housing at the top of the tower, he encountered something unexpected. Standard nacelle configuration placed primary mechanical systems in accessible arrangements for maintenance purposes. Turbine 47's interior layout matched engineering specifications with one notable exception. An access panel in the floor of the nacelle had been welded shut. The welding appeared crude and inconsistent with professional installation practices, suggesting modification performed outside normal maintenance procedures. Harris documented the irregular welding in his inspection report and decided to investigate further. Using cutting equipment, he carefully removed the unauthorized welds and opened the access panel. Below the nacelle floor, within a confined space typically used for cable routing, Harris discovered a sealed metal container approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot wide. The container showed no identification markings and appeared to have been placed deliberately in a location where it would remain undiscovered during routine maintenance. Harris extracted the container and transported it down the tower to ground level. The weight and sealed construction suggested it contained something more substantial than abandoned tools or forgotten equipment. Opening the container in the controlled environment of his mobile inspection laboratory, Harris found himself looking at materials that clearly didn't belong in a wind turbine. The contents included a waterproof document case containing multiple folders of papers, photographs, and what appeared to be an engineering report. Everything had been carefully preserved using archival quality materials designed to prevent deterioration. Harris examined the documents with growing astonishment. The papers included detailed technical assessments of turbine modifications dated from early 1988, along with photographs showing internal structural components that had been replaced with substandard parts. An engineering report bearing the signature of Charles Porter documented systematic safety violations across multiple turbines in the installation. Handwritten notes in the margins indicated Porter had intended to submit this report to regulatory authorities but feared corporate retaliation. Most significant were the notarized statements from 2 Windtech Industries employees, dated October 1988, describing pressure from management to falsify maintenance records and install uncertified components to reduce operational costs. The statements specifically mentioned concerns raised by an operator named Timothy Richardson, who had been documenting safety violations and planned to report them to authorities. Harris immediately recognized that he had discovered evidence related to a decades-old case. He secured the materials and contacted the Kern County Sheriff's Department to report his findings. The documents were transferred to cold case investigators who began the process of verifying their authenticity and relevance to unsolved disappearances from 1988. Forensic examination confirmed that the papers dated from the correct time period and that Charles Porter's signature matched known examples from his professional work. The employee statements were verified through handwriting analysis and cross-referenced with employment records. Everything Harris had found appeared to be authentic evidence that had been deliberately hidden inside turbine 47 decades earlier. The discovery prompted investigators to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the area surrounding turbine 47. The surveys detected an anomaly in the soil approximately 30 meters from the turbine's base, at a depth suggesting deliberate burial rather than natural deposition. Excavation authorization was obtained, and a forensic archaeology team was deployed to the site. What they found beneath 3 meters of desert soil would finally answer questions that had haunted Jessica Richardson for 35 years. The remains were carefully exhumed and transported to the county medical examiner's facility for analysis. Preliminary examination indicated the presence of personal effects that could be traced to Timothy Richardson through manufacturer records and family identification. The forensic evidence suggested that Timothy had indeed been at Turbine 47 on the night of October 14, 1988, but not because of the storm. Someone had arranged to meet him there, away from witnesses and surveillance. What had been portrayed as a tragic accident or voluntary disappearance now appeared to be something far more deliberate. As investigators processed the scene and began building a comprehensive case file, they made another crucial discovery. The soil analysis revealed trace evidence suggesting a second set of remains had once been buried at the same location, but had been removed at some later date. The excavation patterns indicated professional knowledge of concealment techniques, and the time frame of the secondary disturbance couldn't be precisely determined. The case that had been closed for decades suddenly exploded into a complex criminal investigation spanning multiple disappearances, corporate fraud, and a cover-up that had persisted for more than 3 decades. Pacific Renewable Energy Corporation cooperated fully with authorities, providing access to all historical records inherited when they acquired the facility. Those records included personnel files that would prove essential in identifying suspects who had worked at the wind farm in 1988. Among those files was the employment history of Robert Mitchell, who had served as Timothy Richardson's supervisor and had provided inconsistent statements to Detective Morrison 35 years earlier. Mitchell, now 68 years old and long retired, would soon find investigators arriving at his door with questions he could no longer dismiss or deflect. The evidence Daniel Harris had discovered in Turbine 47 was about to unravel a conspiracy that its architects had believed was safely buried in the past. May 2023. Kern County Sheriff's Department Headquarters. The discovery at Turbine 47 had transformed a cold case into an active homicide investigation with implications reaching far beyond a single missing person. Lead investigator Lieutenant Sarah Chen assembled a task force combining cold case detectives, forensic specialists, and financial crimes investigators to examine 35 years of evidence, both old and newly discovered. The forensic examination of the remains found near Turbine 47 confirmed what investigators had suspected. Dental records and DNA analysis positively identified Timothy Richardson. The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, inconsistent with accident scenarios that had been proposed in 1988. The injury pattern suggested Timothy had been struck from behind, and the body had been moved to its burial location shortly after death. Personal effects recovered with the remains included Timothy's work identification badge, his wedding ring, and a damaged wristwatch stopped at 9:15. Cross-referencing this timeline with weather records from October 14, 1988, investigators established that Timothy had died hours after the storm began, during a period when official company records showed no authorized personnel at the wind farm. This contradiction immediately focused attention on who had been present at the facility that night and why no documentation of their activities existed. The documents Daniel Harris had discovered inside Turbine 47 provided a roadmap for understanding the events leading to Timothy's death. Charles Porter's engineering report, hidden away for decades, detailed a systematic scheme to replace certified turbine components with cheaper, uncertified alternatives. The cost savings generated by these substitutions had been substantial, but the safety risks were catastrophic. Porter's calculations indicated that several turbines, including 47, were operating with structural integrity compromised to dangerous levels. The notarized statements from Windtech employees revealed the pressure campaign that had accompanied this cost-cutting program. Workers who questioned the substitutions faced threats of termination or were reassigned to positions where they couldn't observe maintenance practices. The corporate culture had evolved to prioritize financial performance over safety compliance, with supervisory staff rewarded for meeting budget reduction targets regardless of how those savings were achieved. Financial investigators traced the flow of money through Windtech Industries during the 1986-1988 period. They discovered that certain supervisory employees, including Robert Mitchell, had received substantial bonuses tied directly to maintenance cost reductions. Additionally, several supervisors had financial relationships with the unauthorized parts suppliers, receiving payments characterized as consulting fees that appeared to be kickbacks for directing corporate purchases to specific vendors. Mitchell's financial records showed deposits totaling over $40,000 during this period, amounts that far exceeded his legitimate salary and that he had not reported as income. Bank records indicated these deposits came from accounts controlled by parts suppliers who had no documented business relationship with Mitchell beyond their sales to Wintech Industries. The pattern suggested systematic corruption rather than isolated misconduct. Armed with this evidence, investigators obtained arrest warrants for Mitchell and began the process of locating other former Wintech employees who might have been involved in the conspiracy. Mitchell was taken into custody at his home in Bakersfield, where he initially maintained that he had no knowledge of Timothy Richardson's fate and that any financial irregularities could be explained as legitimate consulting work. However, when confronted with the engineering documents found in Turbine 47 and the forensic evidence from the burial site, Mitchell's position shifted. His attorney negotiated a cooperation agreement in exchange for reduced charges, and Mitchell began providing information about the events of October 1988. According to Mitchell's account, Timothy Richardson had scheduled a meeting with him on the evening of October 14th, claiming to have evidence of safety violations that he intended to report to federal authorities. Mitchell said he agreed to meet Timothy at Turbine 47, away from the main facility, to review the evidence privately before any official reports were filed. Mitchell maintained that he had gone to the meeting intending only to convince Timothy to work through internal company channels rather than involving outside regulators. Mitchell's narrative claimed that a physical confrontation had developed when Timothy refused to delay his planned disclosure. Another supervisor, whom Mitchell initially declined to name, had been present at the meeting and had struck Timothy during the argument. Mitchell insisted the death had been accidental, the result of Timothy falling and striking his head rather than an intentional attack. However, forensic evidence contradicted this version, showing that Timothy's injury was consistent with being struck by a heavy object rather than a simple fall. Under continued questioning, Mitchell identified the second person present at Turbine 47 that night as David Sullivan, who had served as Wintech's maintenance director in 1988. Sullivan had died in 2019, making it impossible to verify or challenge Mitchell's account of his involvement. Investigators noted the convenience of this timing, suspecting that Mitchell was attempting to shift primary responsibility onto someone who could no longer defend himself or provide an alternative version of events. The investigation expanded to examine the disappearance of Charles Porter, whose engineering report had been hidden alongside evidence about Timothy Richardson. Financial records showed that Porter had been negotiating his final payment from Wintech Industries during the weeks before his disappearance. Company correspondence indicated disputes about the content of his engineering assessment, with management demanding modifications to his findings before releasing the contracted payment. Porter's sister provided investigators with copies of letters her brother had sent her in June 1988, expressing fear about potential retaliation for refusing to falsify his engineering report. In one letter, Porter explicitly mentioned concerns about the safety of someone named Timothy, who was also documenting problems at the facility. This correspondence established that Porter and Richardson had been aware of each other's parallel efforts to expose the safety violations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the wind farm property identified several additional anomalies that warranted investigation. One site, located approximately 200 meters from Turbine 47, showed disturbance patterns consistent with the location where Timothy Richardson had been found. Excavation of this secondary site revealed evidence of previous burial and removal of remains, matching the trace evidence found at the primary burial location. Forensic analysis of soil samples from both sites indicated that they had been disturbed during the same general time period, likely within weeks of each other. DNA evidence recovered from the secondary site was degraded but sufficient for comparison. The genetic profile matched reference samples obtained from Charles Porter's sister, confirming that the consultant engineer had met a fate similar to Timothy Richardson's. The realization that at least 2 murders had been committed to protect the cost-cutting conspiracy transformed the investigation's scope. Authorities began examining whether other Windtech employees who had left the company under suspicious circumstances might have been victims rather than voluntary departures. Employment records identified 3 additional workers who had raised safety concerns in 1987-1988 and subsequently left the company abruptly, severing contact with former colleagues. 2 of these former employees were located and interviewed. Both reported having been threatened and told that accidents could happen to workers who created problems for management. One had accepted a cash settlement in exchange for signing extensive non-disclosure agreements. The other had simply disappeared from his job one day, too frightened to pursue severance pay or unemployment benefits. Neither had been aware that their concerns about equipment safety were part of a larger pattern that had cost lives. As the investigation deepened, it became clear that the conspiracy had involved more people than Mitchell and Sullivan. Corporate executives who had approved the cost-cutting programs and ignored engineering warnings bore responsibility for creating the environment where corruption flourished and whistleblowers became targets. Several of these executives had retired wealthy from their Windtech careers, never facing consequences for their decisions. The case that had begun with a routine turbine inspection had exposed institutional corruption that had spanned years and claimed multiple victims. But investigators still faced the challenge of proving beyond reasonable doubt exactly who had done what, and building cases that could withstand legal challenges 3.5 decades after the crimes occurred. The final chapter of justice for Timothy Richardson and Charles Porter was about to be written, but the path forward would require navigating complex legal terrain where evidence had degraded, witnesses had died, and corporate entities had long since dissolved into larger organizations that bore no legal responsibility for past crimes. August 2023, Kern County Superior Court. 4 months after Daniel Harris discovered the hidden evidence in Turbine 47, the criminal justice system began the complex process of holding accountable those responsible for events that had occurred 35 years earlier. The case presented unique challenges: key witnesses deceased, corporations dissolved, and evidence that required careful authentication to be admissible in court. Robert Mitchell faced charges of voluntary manslaughter, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice. His defense team argued that the passage of time made fair trial impossible and that his cooperation with investigators demonstrated acceptance of responsibility. However, prosecutors maintained that Mitchell had deliberately concealed a homicide for decades while living freely, and that his partial admissions were calculated attempts to minimize his legal exposure rather than genuine cooperation. The forensic evidence proved crucial in countering Mitchell's narrative. Examination of Timothy Richardson's remains showed that the fatal injury came from a heavy cylindrical object, consistent with a large wrench or pipe, not from an accidental fall. Impact analysis indicated significant force had been applied, ruling out the scenario of an unintentional injury during a struggle. The positioning of the burial site and the care taken to conceal the body demonstrated premeditation rather than panicked response to an accident. Additional charges were filed related to the death of Charles Porter, though these presented greater evidential challenges. The removal of Porter's remains from the secondary burial site years after his death had eliminated much of the forensic evidence that might have definitively established cause of death. However, the circumstances of his disappearance, his documented conflict with Windtech management, and the discovery of his engineering report hidden with evidence about Timothy Richardson created a compelling pattern of deliberate elimination of whistleblowers. 2 other former Windtech supervisors were indicted on conspiracy and fraud charges related to the parts substitution scheme. Both had received financial benefits from the unauthorized supplier relationships and had actively worked to conceal the safety violations from regulatory authorities. Their roles in the deaths of Richardson and Porter couldn't be definitively established, but their participation in the broader conspiracy made them accessories to the cover-up that had prevented justice for decades. The preliminary hearings attracted significant media attention, focusing public awareness on corporate misconduct and the vulnerability of employees who attempt to expose safety violations. Jessica Richardson, now 73 years old, attended every court proceeding, finally receiving acknowledgement that her husband had been the dedicated safety advocate she had always known him to be, rather than a careless worker who had caused his own death. The Richardson family filed wrongful death litigation against the successor corporations that had acquired Windtech Industries' assets over the years. While these companies bore no direct responsibility for the 1988 events, their ownership of the wind farm property and their inheritance of Windtech's business operations created potential liability under California law. The civil case sought both compensation for Jessica Richardson and broader accountability for the institutional failures that had enabled the conspiracy. In September 2023, facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of additional charges related to Charles Porter's death, Robert Mitchell accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in Timothy Richardson's death and agreed to provide complete testimony about the events of October 1988, including details he had previously withheld. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to file murder charges related to Porter's death, though Mitchell acknowledged involvement in concealing that crime as well. Mitchell's allocution before the court provided the fullest account of what had happened at Turbine 47 on the night Timothy Richardson died. Mitchell admitted that he and David Sullivan had lured Timothy to the remote location under false pretenses, intending to intimidate him into silence about the safety violations. When Timothy refused to abandon his planned disclosure and threatened to contact media outlets if the company wouldn't act, Sullivan had attacked him with a pipe wrench kept in the turbine maintenance kit. Mitchell acknowledged that Timothy's death had been deliberate rather than accidental, though he maintained that Sullivan had acted without his advance knowledge or approval. However, Mitchell admitted to helping conceal the body, participating in the cover-up, and later being involved in Charles Porter's death when the engineer similarly refused to modify his safety assessment. Mitchell claimed that Porter's death had been Sullivan's decision as well, but that he had helped dispose of the body and had later returned to move the remains when construction activity near the original burial site threatened discovery. The court sentenced Mitchell to 15 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 85% of the term. At 68 years old, the sentence effectively meant Mitchell would spend his remaining years incarcerated. The judge noted that while the passage of time had complicated justice, it had not diminished the severity of the crimes or the defendant's moral culpability for choosing silence over truth for more than 3 decades. The 2 former supervisors charged with conspiracy accepted plea agreements rather than face trial. Both received sentences of 4 years for their roles in the fraud scheme and the subsequent cover-up. Restitution orders required them to forfeit financial gains obtained through their illegal activity, though most of those funds had been spent long ago. The civil litigation resulted in a settlement providing Jessica Richardson with financial compensation and establishing a memorial fund in Timothy's name to support workplace safety advocacy and whistleblower protection. Pacific Renewable Energy Corporation, the current facility operator, agreed to fund safety training programs and to establish protocols for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. The California Division of Occupational Safety conducted a comprehensive review of wind energy industry oversight, implementing new inspection protocols and enhanced protections for workers who report safety violations. Timothy Richardson's documentation of the turbine component substitutions became a case study in engineering ethics programs, demonstrating the life and death importance of maintaining safety standards even under pressure to reduce costs. Charles Porter's sister filed wrongful death litigation seeking accountability for her brother's murder. The case faced significant challenges due to the removal of Porter's remains and the death of David Sullivan, the person Mitchell had identified as primarily responsible for both killings. However, the civil court found sufficient evidence of conspiracy and corporate negligence to award damages against the entities that had acquired Windtech's business operations. In December 2023, a memorial service was held at the Tehachapi Pass Wind Farm to honor Timothy Richardson and Charles Porter. Their families, former colleagues, and representatives from worker safety organizations gathered near the location where Turbine 47 had once stood. The turbine had been dismantled as part of the decommissioning project, but a permanent marker was installed at the site commemorating both men and acknowledging their courage in attempting to expose dangerous conditions. Jessica Richardson addressed the gathering, expressing gratitude that the truth had finally emerged and that her husband's reputation had been vindicated. She noted that while no legal outcome could restore what had been taken from her family, the accountability achieved through the investigation and prosecution provided meaningful acknowledgement of the injustice that had been committed. The case prompted legislative action in California to strengthen protections for industrial whistleblowers and to extend statutes of limitation for crimes involving corporate cover-ups. The law, designated the Richardson-Porter Worker Safety Act, created enhanced legal frameworks for investigating workplace deaths and required independent oversight of corporate internal investigations into safety allegations. Daniel Harris, the engineer whose inspection had uncovered the hidden evidence, received recognition from professional engineering organizations for his thoroughness and integrity. His decision to investigate the unusual welding in Turbine 47, rather than simply noting it and moving on, had proven the difference between truth remaining forever buried and justice finally being served. The investigation into the Tehachapi Pass wind farm case officially closed in January 2024, with prosecutors determining that all surviving individuals who bore criminal responsibility had been charged and adjudicated. The institutional failures that had enabled the conspiracy were addressed through civil litigation and regulatory reform. While the decades of delay had prevented full justice for the victims and their families, the final accounting had established truth and imposed consequences on those who had chosen profit over human life. Timothy Richardson's story transformed from a cautionary tale about industrial accidents into a testament to the importance of workers who refuse to remain silent in the face of dangerous corporate misconduct. His documentation, preserved by chance and discovered through diligence, had reached across 35 years to ensure that truth ultimately prevailed over conspiracy. In death, he had achieved what circumstance had prevented him from accomplishing in life: holding accountable those who placed financial gain above human safety, and ensuring that their crimes would not remain hidden forever in the desert wind.